sitting up on stage now, or as you are required? Because I think
Are you all presenting?
I'm going to hand over to them
Okay.
at a certain point, so shall I can ask.
Well, maybe feel free if you go there and Wendy.
And then I'll move to.
Yes. Okay.
yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, good afternoon. Glad to see that everyone has been seated and we don't have to be playing musical chairs this afternoon. We wanted the venue here because there are some good audio-visual facilities, and also it's quite a handy spot in the centre of Sydney. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. You've probably seen the highlights of the venue, the delicious tea and coffee, the biscuits, and the toilets, which are in the main mezzanine area where we gathered before. And if you need to escape quickly, either because you've got another appointment or because there's some calamity happening here, there is a very quick entranceway down the door to the left, straight out onto the street. Now, the idea today is that we've invited both people from the community housing sector and also from the consultancy and support sectors as well. So it's a broad audience of different people here, and we're hoping to get some interaction between different people's ideas as well. Now, this is somewhere between being a sort of fairly typical briefing about a project that's coming along and also a way of sharing broadly more information about what fundamentally is behind that, which is the NHFIC loans. There will be quite a few acronyms this afternoon, but they will all be carefully revealed and hopefully not too threatening for everyone. So we'll be sharing information about the programme. That will be a session that I'll be doing a little bit later. We'll be increasing people's knowledge about these loans as well, because as essentially bankers, NHFIC are quite keen to carry on lending to people. But also we're going to be taking feedback from this workshop and from workshops that are going to be similarly run in Melbourne and Brisbane. So hopefully we can design the scheme in as easy a way as possible for everyone involved while still having the controls in place. And of course, it's good to network as well. I'm sure the consultants will be very keen to speak to people from the community housing sector who are here. Now, the people on the front row here are going to be videoed. So watch out on YouTube for the latest viral hit after today's session. But that's a way of allowing people who live slightly further away than the main capital cities and also live in states that we're not going to find out what's happening as well. So everyone is included. There is no escape. So I'll give a very, very short snapshot, generally without words, so at least there won't be many words on the PowerPoint slide, although I might say a few myself. We're then going to have Wendy Hayhurst from the peak body, CHIA, Community Housing Industry Association, for those who don't know. And then we're going to have Humair from FACS, who's representing the government, to say how the scheme that we're proposing here today will fit in with the broader initiatives the New South Wales government is working through. And then we're going to have the team from NHFIC, Natalie and friends, who are going to tell you the intricacies of bond finance, brackets, how to borrow it. And then the two sessions that we'll have after that, we'll be looking at getting input and having a little bit more of a chat. So that's probably when, ideally, a lot of the questions will come forward. Everybody, hopefully, will stay, and first we'll focus on community housing organisation issues, and then we'll look at issues for consultants and the panel. I should be revealing all a little bit later on that, including the opening date and closing date, which I know consultants will be keen to hear. So simply in one slide, what is it we're talking about? We're going to be going through this in more detail later in the presentation, but I just wanted to set a little bit of a background here and highlight a few of the attractive faces of the different characters involved. Well, the NHFIC, a sort of Commonwealth government agency, has been promoted by the Coalition Party and is also supported by the Labour Party as well. So whoever's happy face is occupying the lodge, we will be carrying on having NHFIC funding. And it's probably one of the more fundamental reforms we've had in the community housing sector for a number of years. To actually get cheaper, long-term money is a fantastic initiative. Now, I'm not a political pundit. I'll be voting on election day. I'll be sizzling my sausage. But whoever wins the election, if the coalition win, we'll know what's happening. But there is a potential, if the Labour Party win the Commonwealth election, that 250,000 affordable homes are going to be built over the next 10 years. Now, that would obviously mean a lot more activity for the community housing sector and also for people wanting to borrow money to build the properties, because I take it not everyone's got enough money in the kitty to build those out of cash. But whatever happens, we have a state government here in New South Wales that's been a steady supporter of the community housing sector's growth, at least in the last few years, and we have supportive people within the administration as well. So with NHFIC, which is a lending body at the end of the day, they're trying to make loans. I'm an ex-banker, I'll admit that, but please don't hold that too much against me. A lot of my good friends are still bankers. They're looking to lend money to community housing organisations. But for a number of the smaller organisations, they're going to need a little bit of support along the way, potentially. And so they've developed a grants programme. And it's essentially the grants programme component that we'll be talking about today. Now, NHFIC have, if you like, outsourced a lot of the administration of that to CHIA. And CHIA's boss, Wendy, has passed that on to myself and John Stott. So we have taken off our hats as being consultants, and we've put on our hats as being cheerleaders in the organisation. And so our role really is to help coordinate on behalf of CHIA and NHFIC how the grants programme works. So for both consultants and for community housing organisations, you'll probably be dealing with John and I and perhaps Wendy rather than directly with NHFIC for the grants programme. But we work in a controlled environment. We won't be appointing ourselves as consultants to get any of the business. We're out of the consulting game for a slight while there. So that's the general overview. Those are the actors, those are the players who are involved in the process, consultants and community housing organisations. How will all that come together? So let's hear first a perspective from CHIA. Wendy.
Thank you, Tony. I also want to acknowledge we're meeting on Aboriginal land and pay my respects to elders past and present and any Aboriginal people in the room, and also say that I'm hoping that this initiative is going to help all community housing providers, including Aboriginal providers that are registered in the national system as well. I'm not going to spend a lot of time because I'm not going to give you technical detail, but I think it's quite important to sort of situate this initiative. And I'm talking here about NHFIC. I'm going to have a test about what these acronyms are at the end and how much you've learnt there. How NHFIC really fits in with the community housing industry. For some of you, you may not know how long and hard the sector has argued for lower cost finance and simpler finance as well. So one of the things that I hear as CEO, and I heard it very much when I was at CHIA New South Wales, was about the short-term nature of loans that were on offer, the transaction costs that go with that, and the relatively high interest rates that providers were paying as well. And when you're doing something which is very marginal anyway, where the returns are very, very low for social and affordable housing, those sorts of costs can add quite significantly to development. So we've argued long and hard, not just CHIA New South Wales, but other peak bodies, that having some facility where we could aggregate the borrowing requirements of what was still a relatively small sector and then go to institutional investors where we felt we would get lower cost finance was very important. The fact that it's also ended up being bipartisan, that both sides of government, both parties, major parties have supported it, brings in, I think, another thing that we've often found as the sector, and that's an initiative of one government, is then, how shall we say, almost trashed, isn't it, by another government. This has bipartisan support, so it's there for the long term. As a peak body, we represent all community housing providers of whatever size and shape they are. And naturally, the first emphasis has been on the larger Tier 1 organisations. As you would expect, they've already been borrowing, they already have some pipeline, not a great deal, but some pipeline. NHFIC have already lent, they've secured their first bond. And just to give you an idea of how successful that was, one of the CEOs, Charles Northcote from Blue Chip, told me he's taken 70 million, which is a lot of money. He told me that that was going to save him $1 million a year in interest charges. That is not to be sniffed at in an organisation like ours. Now, what we didn't want to do and what NHFIC don't want to do is presume that smaller organisations will not use NHFIC. The briefing sessions that we've had have, for obvious reasons, focused entirely on Tier 1s. But Tier 2s and Tier 3s, as I said to someone, and to use that famous song, from small acorns, big oak trees grow, don't they? So if we presume that small organisations were unable to grow or diversify or partner with others, and I think that's really crucial, partner with larger organisations, then we are doing the sector a disservice and we won't have such a great community housing sector. So for me, this is really important because this is taking the focus away from the larger, not entirely, because I think that small organisations can work with larger ones, which is why we opened this session up to the tier 1s as well. So we want to really have a conversation here and to a certain extent through the grant process about how we can help the Tier 2s and Tier 3s take advantage of this. There are programmes out there. You may well talk about some. I know some at the Commonwealth. There is the Domestic Violence Initiatives, which is really targeted at people doing services and accommodation for women fleeing violence. So there are opportunities out there. So I hope today we can convince you this is a programme worth thinking about and indeed applying for. Thank you very much.
Perhaps the only thing that isn't lining up is the technology, but I'm sure we'll manage to get that one fixed. You know, it is actually quite a rare opportunity. Some of us have been around the community housing sector for longer than we'd like to imagine, and there have been many lean years, both at a Commonwealth and a state level, and finance has always been difficult, but maybe we're starting to see that shift as well. And one of the things I think that's going to come out of this exercise is going to be a better structuring of the consulting sector as well. Dare I say, you know, more transparent and more competition between community housing providers at a time when there's more business for consultants to do, I think is going to be a win-win situation. But let's move on with NHFIC. Natalie, can you tell us how to get a loan from yourselves?
Thank you. I'm Natalie Joslich. I'm the Director Strategy and Operations at NHFIC. Joining me today are Rowena Johnston, who is our Director Credit, and Ken Yamamoto, who is he's an Associate Director in our Origination team. Oh, hello, here we are. Thank you. So I will tell you a little bit about us and the two arms, the bond aggregator and the NIF, and then I will hand over to Rowena and Ken to talk in a little bit more detail about what we look for in finance proposals and what the process actually is. So as has been mentioned, I think a couple of times already, NHFIC was established mid-last year on the 30th of June with bipartisan support. The board was able to make investment decisions from the end of September last year. So we've only been around sort of, you know, in an operational rhythm for about 9 months, if my maths is correct. And remember, I'm not from the origination or credit team. We are a corporate Commonwealth entity. We have a guarantee by the Commonwealth. We operate under our own legislation, the National Housing Finance and Investment Corporation Act, and then sitting underneath that Act is an investment direction from the Treasurer that provides some more details on our functions, specifically the operation of the Affordable Housing Bond Aggregator and the National Housing Infrastructure Facility, as well as within that we can also provide grants to CHPs for business advisory services, which is obviously the subject of this workshop. As we have up there, our mission is to improve housing outcomes for Australians by reducing pressure on housing affordability. And we do this in a number of ways, including helping to increase the supply of housing, encouraging investment in housing, providing loans, grants and investments that complement programs at other levels of government, and also contributing to the development of the community housing sector. This is just sort of showing in illustrative form the two arms that we have and the various flows and the organisations that are involved. I'll talk through those in a little bit more detail, but again, just to show that we've got the Affordable Housing Bond Aggregator and the National Housing Infrastructure Facility. We have an independent board that makes all of our investment decisions and a CEO. We actually had a board meeting earlier today. So just showing you our governance structure. So again, board that's supported by, I'll step away, by an audit and risk committee and also a bond issue and due diligence management committee that was set up in advance of the first bond issuance that we had in March this year. And there's a credit committee that is a management committee that is sort of a step in the assessment process for transactions. Underneath that, we've got origination and credit teams, my own team, and then finance, legal. We have support from NHFIC via a service level agreement, so lots of our back office support functions. Okay, to the main areas. So the NHIF is a $1 billion facility that provides funding for new or upgraded infrastructure that will unlock housing supply. So it's not for the housing, this fund is not for the housing itself, it is for the critical housing enabling infrastructure. So things like sewerage, electricity, telecommunications, site remediation for both brownfield and greenfield sites. This fund is open to community housing providers, to local and state government, and to special purpose vehicles that have one of those foundation members. The key thing to remember about the NHIF is additionality. So this idea that without our financing, the new housing supply would proceed at a slower pace, or you wouldn't have as much of an uplift in affordable housing. So if we're able to, through our financing, help bring forward a project or make a project that was not otherwise viable, or we can get more of an uplift in social or affordable housing through the provision of that concessional finance, that would then be an eligible project for consideration under the NHIF. The way the concessionality works is that we take the applicable market interest rate, and then we basically reduce that for the smallest concession that is required to allow the project to proceed. Different to the bond aggregator, which is a cost plus model, which I'll get to in a moment. So we have grants. A portion of the $1 billion is grants, and then the bulk of it is in the form of concessional loans. The idea is that this is a perpetual facility, so that the funds would be recycled and be able to be used for further projects in the future. So CHPs potentially can access both the NHIF and the Affordable Housing Bond Aggregator. So in terms of the AHBA, as has been mentioned, it provides low-cost, longer tenor loans to registered CHPs. It is open to community housing providers that are registered under a relevant state or territory law. So narrower remit in terms of eligibility than the NHIF. The loans can be used to acquire or construct new housing stock, to maintain an existing stock, to assist with working capital requirements or general corporate requirements, or to refinance existing debts. As has been mentioned, the majority of the first transactions that have been approved and that were financed through the bond issuance were for refinancing transactions, but the board has approved policies for construction lending, so we are expecting that future loans will provide funding for more, for larger and more complex housing supply related projects. Where the loan is for a mixed tenure development, so where there is a portion of affordable and market sale rental properties, we need to be satisfied that any surplus funds from the development are applied to affordable housing, to support affordable housing outcomes, so to reduce leakage, basically. We issue our own bonds to fund these loans at lower cost and longer tenor from traditional bank finance. We also have a $1 billion line of credit from the Commonwealth that we are able to use to warehouse loans and also fund construction activities. So until we get sufficient scale to issue another bond, we're able to use the line of credit. In terms of, I'll just finish with that. I'll just talk about the bonds and then I'll come back to. So, mention that our first bond issuance was in late March, and that was $315 million with an issue yield of 2.38%, which is extremely competitive. As I've said, we have the Commonwealth guarantee, and we were assigned a AAA rating by S&P. Our bonds also have they've got social bond status, which made them very desirable, and also a number of other features like their high quality liquid asset status, repo eligibility. We had a very high quality final order book. We were 4 times oversubscribed and had 30 investors participating in the transaction. We used those funds. We immediately used the funds that we sourced from the bond to finance a number of loan facilities, as I said, the majority of which were refinancing at a fixed rate of under 3% for 10-year interest-only loans. As I said, we expect to be providing funding for more housing supply-related projects and have a healthy pipeline of potential bond aggregator deals, and we're also in consultation on the NHFIC. Now, I'm going to hand over to Rowena and Ken to talk more about our construction policy and finance proposals.
Lovely. Thanks, Natalie. So as Natalie mentioned, my name is Rowena Johnston. I'm the Director of Credit at NHFIC. I'm also the Chair of the Credit Committee, not the fun police, as many people in the organisation like to call me, but we have, as Natalie said, already funded a number of loans through the NHFIC amounting approximately $315 million, and that was across 6 at the moment community housing providers, all of which were Tier 1. The intention is not to only provide loans to Tier 1 providers. We absolutely don't want to be an organisation that continues only for the haves. We would also like to enable some growth, and to that end we will work on a consultative basis with all of the community housing sector to ensure that the way that we are lending and the formation of our policies is consistent with the business objectives of the sector. So at the moment, I suppose the role of my team and of the credit committee is to assess loans that come to us on a holistic basis. We will look at the financial veracity of the loan and the robustness of the counterparty sitting behind it. But we will also assess the loan in line with the investment mandate that Natalie has mentioned to ensure that the purpose of the loan meets the overarching objective of the NHFIC, and that is to improve the housing outcomes for all Australians. So our job is not purely just to assess the loan application, it's to look at holistically what we are trying to achieve with each loan. Notwithstanding, there does have to be some level of veracity underneath that holistic assessment, and we do have some covenants that we apply and test. And apologies if I dip into any sort of financial jargon, and please, if I say a term you don't know, I'm happy to define it. Primarily for investment type facilities, we tend to have two primary covenants. The first one being the loan to valuation ratio, which is generally the total loan amount compared with or as a ratio to the total security offered as first mortgage. We will have that covenant set at between 50 and 55%. In order to go to the 55% level, there needs to be a very strong government-backed income stream generated by the properties. So it's more often than not set somewhere between 45 to 50%. We'll generally have what we call a draw stop at 45%, whereby the covenant is at 50, but you may only draw funds on an initial basis up to 45, just to allow a small buffer for any movement in asset values. The other primary covenant that we use is an interest cover ratio, and that is that the income from the properties offered as security must cover your forecast interest requirements by at least 1.5 times. So, for example, if you had interest obligations of $1 million a year, you would need income from your properties of $1.5 million a year at a minimum.
Just to mention, it does say between 1.25 and 2, so typically we'll be aiming for the 1.5, but
Yeah.
in certain circumstances, should the need arise, we would go down to 1.25 if the reason is compelling, but broadly speaking, it's the 1.5 times. Sorry.
Absolutely. No, I agree. So we'd also look at the security structure that's being offered, obviously, and the types of securities, but we would look at that in conjunction with your general business model and how you run your own business. We'll look at the blend of social and affordable housing within your portfolio. But we are well and truly able to accommodate and understand any sort of complexities to your financial structures and factor that into our consideration of the loan. As Natalie mentioned, the tenor of the loan is much longer than you may get with more traditional financing through banks, and we have funded all loans to date for 10 years rather than the typical sort of 2 to 5 year bank financing that you might find, and at much more competitive pricing. In terms of construction loans, this is a new policy for the moment, but we have already approved funding for one community housing provider for construction loan. That was a $46 million loan across 2 projects in Sydney. So the pricing will depend on the risks associated with construction for that particular project. It's very much a bespoke exercise pricing the loan, and you may expense the interest either by pay it from your own P&L or capitalise your interest into the facility. Because of the nature of the bond aggregator versus the line of credit, we will be funding construction loans through the line of credit. I'm sure you've spoken or heard from NHFIC before about security. We take mortgages, general security deeds, and in the case of construction loans, we will need tripartite deeds between the builder and yourselves and us. We have a maximum loan to cost ratio of 70% within our construction policy. That's a total development cost ratio. And as it says here, you can include land, construction costs, soft costs, contingency, any financing costs, and that would include council contributions and any other contributions you're required to make. And it will depend on how you factor in your income, or your interest expense, beg your pardon. And we would need full takeout security. So at the end of the project, you would need to demonstrate how, if you are planning to build and hold the development, we would need to have demonstration that the resultant takeout loan could service the debt. And we fund on a traditional construction basis in that you need to, every drawdown would be on a cost to complete basis. All right.
So do we want to do questions as we go through, or do you want to do it at the end?
What would you prefer?
Towards the end?
All right.
Because I can imagine there might be some questions on that slide.
Absolutely. We might need to come back to that slide. All right, I'll just hand over to Ken for the process.
Might just help, yeah. So mine's pretty straightforward. So I'm Ken Yamamoto. I am the Associate Director in Origination. So I'm probably the first point of call if you're interested in having a chat to us. I will be one of the first people you'll probably speak to. So I try to be as friendly as possible, as transparent as possible. I'm genuinely a nice guy. It's Roy who's the fun police, as she said.
I'm nice too.
Actually, Roy's nicer than I am. So my discussion's really more about the process, I suppose. So this is what's on the slide, I suppose, is the formal process. But in reality, if you just want to have a chat about what the product is and how it all works and how you may or may not fit into this equation, by all means, pick up the phone. You don't have to go through the formal expression of interest website, but should you want to, you can go through that process. It's a simple click on the website and it brings up a form and asks you a bunch of questions, which generally takes about 10 minutes. So it's not an onerous process, but by all means, pick up the phone, leave a message. One of us will get back to you and we can talk to you more broadly about the product and how you may fit into this, should you be interested. Once we've had the discussion, I suppose, and you've gone away and thought about potentially what you might want, and that will involve a discussion with your internal stakeholders and management, boards, etc. Lodge an EOI, we'll then pick it up and then we'll call you back and say, okay, let's have a proper discussion. And that really talks to what you're specifically looking for and how we can assist. And I guess a lot more detail involved in that discussion. And that may take some time to firm up. We may want you to go back to your management and say, well, this is what NHFIC can do. What do you think? And there'll be a bit of toing and froing. So that can take a bit of time. And then once we're all happy and we think, okay, we've got something here, then it gets down to the nitty-gritty, which is the application. So I suppose one of the important questions people may ask is, how long is an application going to take? I would say a minimum of 3 months. We could push it through faster, but typically it's going to take you some time to get your application right and in a form for us to review and consider properly. Obviously, with anything, the more information you give us, the better, and it just makes our job much more easy to assess and put you forward. We want to promote you, so I guess to the next slide is there we go. Next slide. Yeah, what are we looking for? So once you get to the application stage and you go, yeah, I want to do this, what does an application need to look like? And it really comes down to, this is a dialogue between yourselves and us. For me, I always consider an information memorandum, which is that top one, as a sales pitch. It's a sales document. You want to put your best foot forward to demonstrate to us why we think it's a good idea for you to borrow the money. And so going through the IM, you want to talk to who you are, where you've been, and there's been a lot of consolidation in the sector over the years, and where you came from, your management style, your strategy going forward, what you currently manage, what you own, the development that you may or may not have done or but are looking to do. So it's really just about putting forward your best foot so we can consider you as a possible lending client. Aside from, so that will probably take you the most part of the application process. I would say that it's a good month to get your document right as far as your information memorandum, because it needs to cover off on a whole raft of things, including insurance policy, your vacancy rates, the quality of the assets you're putting up, your previous lending experiences, the whole history of where you've been and where you'd like to go. So that will take some time. The other key thing, I suppose, out of this, I won't go through every single one, but the other key one to come out of this is really that financial forecast. And this is maybe potentially where some of this grant funding might assist if you don't have in-house capacity to generate your own cash flows and forecasts and P&Ls and balance sheets. So what we're looking for to assess the credit in the first instance is your ability to repay from a financial perspective, and we will look to match the forecast with the tenor of the loan. So if you're going for a 10-year funding, we would like to see a 10-year P&L, cash flow and balance sheet. So that will take some time as well. I'm not sure how many of you so are you all familiar with the National Registrar's format? That is a 10-year forecast typically. Yeah, so it's just similar to that. We would like to delve into each of the different components of the revenue. What are the key drivers? So there'll probably be a bit more digging, a bit more thoroughness to that. But it's broadly, that's what it looks like with some backing behind it so we can look at what the numbers and how they're being derived. They're probably the two key ones I wanted to speak to. And the other ones are probably self-explanatory, other financing agreements you may have, demonstrated history of what you've delivered, security pool details, etc., etc. So that's pretty much all I wanted to say.
Okay.
Yep.
Yes, one more.
One more.
So with that information received, and obviously the more information that we have about what you'd like to do and what your organisation does, it makes it much easier for us to build a good case for approval for you. So the more information we have, the more help we can be of to you. So after the assessment of Ken and the origination team, my team and I will examine the credit submission and look at whether or not we think it is appropriate for NHFIC funds usage, but we will also look at the benefits that will be derived from what you are going to use the money for. So what additional housing outcomes will arise from provision of these funds, or what are you going to do with the savings that you make on the interest cost reductions. So we will be absolutely always trying to demonstrate to our credit committee and to our board that this is an appropriate use of funds and that it is contributing positively to housing outcomes. So we'll make our assessment, and if appropriate, we will recommend the loan to the credit committee. As I mentioned, I chair the credit committee, but as the person who assesses the loan, I don't have a casting vote on its endorsement. But if it is endorsed by the credit committee for submission to the board, we then present the transaction to the board for final approval. And then we will issue terms. But it may be that at the credit committee stage of the process, we will issue indicative terms, which can be considered by yourselves and your boards. And if it's appropriate, that's the point at which we would seek endorsement and approval from our board for final terms. So that's probably an awful lot of information in a short period of time. So very happy to answer any questions that you have, particularly on this slide. We have requirements within. We're happy to either provide templates, or if you have existing documents, we're happy to review those and see if appropriate. We don't have we're happy either way. As long as they're acceptable to our legal counsel, we're happy to accept them. Oh, up front, 25 basis points. 25 basis points, so 0.25% of the total facility limit is an establishment fee.
Yep.
That's
there's
it.
no line fee on undrawn. No line
No.
fees. No, it's all wrapped up in our margin in the construction.
Mm-hmm. So we, Natalie mentioned, we run a cost recovery model. We're not for profit. So at the moment, we recover 55 basis points, or 0.55%. For investment loans, and then we have a liquidity premium for bond issuances. So, for example, the first bond issue was a base rate of 2.38% with a 0.55% liquidity premium. We have external legal counsel engaged. We've used King & Wood Mallesons for the first bond issuance, and we cap the legal fee at a certain amount, and then we pay over that cap. Yes. I mean, it's obviously tailored on a bespoke basis, but yes. That's right. Yeah, we have common terms, and then we have facility agreements ancillary to that.
It's in our interest because we're here to support the CHP sector. So what we lending provided to one CHP, we want to try and make sure the same terms. Also, yeah.
Yes.
Yep. We do
Absolutely.
the takeout as well. Yeah. So we do it all up front at the same time, do the construction and the takeout assessment up front.
So the takeout should be consistent with how we generally run our investment loans. So we'd want to see a resultant LVR position of 50% or less on the takeout. Yeah.
And with the construction loans, if you wanted to, we say it's 70% total cost. If you wanted to ratchet that up, you can. If you have other collateral security, you can put into the pool that can support. You can pull, yeah, correct.
You can.
If you want to bring that up.
So your equity participation in a construction loan can be any combination of cash and additional collateral.
That 30% would be on collateral.
Absolutely.
Correct.
Yes.
Yep.
Yes.
Maybe if there are any other questions, we could take those at the end of the
Sure.
No worries.
Okay. Thanks, Tony.
Thank you.
The only other slide was, oops.
Well, thank you very much for the presentation. It's always good to hear happy and enthusiastic bankers who are trying to provide low-cost finance for social purpose. One quick question. We'll get you the copies out, but we'll perhaps carry on with the presentation. But yes, and also NHFIC do have some nifty handouts, and also they will be here afterwards to be quizzed on various issues as well. So I suppose we've gone to the heights of complexity and technical terms. We've had LVRs, we've had debt financing, bond issues. We need to get back now to the brass tacks of what we can do to actually convert an enthusiastic social purpose bank's loan into helping disadvantaged communities. And that's where the grant programme comes in to help finance some of the capacity building and support. And also, of course, to get some funding for the consultants who always like to be supported on this. Is that...
tricky, everyone, so just bear with us. It's not very intuitive.
Well, I'm sorry, that does mean we're actually going to have to go through the entire presentation again, so I hope you don't mind staying a little bit longer today. Right, we're back on the grants programme now. How can we actually make all this happen and bring the happy partners together, the happy financiers with the happy borrowers? Well, I'm going to be explaining now how this works. Now, as Natalie said, this does come down from a ministerial directive and an act of parliament. So Wendy, John and I can't set up any type of scheme here. We have to follow through due process to make sure that it works fairly. And that's to protect the not inconsiderable amount of our citizens' money that will be given out in grants. It's to make sure that we're fair to the different housing providers and to the consultants. And also, we don't really want to feature on the front page of the Daily Telegraph, which, remember, with NRAS 1, as we'll have to call it now, did sometimes feature with some problems going wrong. My name or anybody else's name will not be splashed there. We've got some processes to go through. But NHFIC are also keen to make a scheme in place that actually works for everybody. So there is some flexibility, I think, around the administrative details that we'll be working on after these workshops. But our role here in the Community Housing Industry Association is to be everyone's friend in this world of new happiness. We will be helping the consultants, we'll be helping the community housing providers. We're providing the information through to the bank. Now, I shall be telling the story of how the process works in 4 chapters. which those of you who've read my latest book, which you probably won't have done, will notice is quite a small book by my standards. So let's start with the details first of the dates. Now, I know that the consultants amongst us will be interested in this, as will the potential grant recipients. Well, the roadshow of this workshop in rockstar fashion will be going between 3 different capital cities this week. We're hoping very much that the expression of interest will be issued on May the 17th. Can't give you a time on the day. Hopefully it will be May the 17th. Proposing to keep that open for 3 weeks. I should explain why it's quite a short time frame coming forward soon. But really, we're aiming towards the ultimate date of July the 1st, which is when we're actually open for business to actually be able to negotiate grants for community housing providers. So is it quite a short time scale? Yes. Can we achieve it? Yes. The sooner that the sector can access this money, the better. Now, the grants programme itself will be open until the end of September 2020, according to the initial funding. However, if it's successful, and if we ask nicely, who knows, it might be continued into the future as well, once the infrastructure has been put in place. So, just in summary, there's going to be an expression of interest to get consultants onto the panel. Once the panel is in place and sitting pretty, applications can then come through for grants from July the 1st. Chapter 1, in the beginning. What types of consultancy services could be provided? Well, it's just not going to be anything in particular. We're not going to be advising about domestic violence or other important areas that we take concern of. They're going to be specific areas that the NHFIC have indicated where that assistance can be made, and they're going to be in 4 general topic areas. And yes, I am going to be telling you what those 4 topic areas are, which probably helps. And the consultants, to get on the panel, will have to demonstrate that they are skilled in one or more of those areas. And I suspect, knowing the consulting community, that many consultants will be skilled in more than one area as well. You generally don't just have one hat as a consultant, you wear many different hats with many different skills there. Now, the focus for who is going to be assisted is for Tier 2 and Tier 3 community housing organisations, as designated under the national regulatory system and kind of designated in Western Australia, where they kind of use the same sort of system. In Victoria, where they do things the Victorian way, the focus is on housing providers, which is effectively their second tier of community housing organisations. But we're also working towards situations where, to build the capacity of the sector, a Tier 2 or Tier 3 organisation, may be smaller, may be specialised, serving some very high needs group people, can actually partner and buddy up with a Tier 1 or housing association organisation in their loan application. So this is an idea of spreading knowledge, spreading the love within the sector. And this may be, for example, let's say there's a particular property where a lot of the property expertise could come from the larger Tier 1 community housing organisation, but there's a specific tenant cohort or group that could be best assisted with the Tier 2 or Tier 3 organisation that they're working with as well. So there has to be a Tier 2 or Tier 3 that's coming to the party to access the system, but they don't necessarily have to come alone. Safety in numbers. Now, these are the 4 areas that we're going to be looking at. Finance. So this could be looking at the finances of a particular project, the finances of your entire community housing organisation. Skills around raising money, risk analysis, and all those nice ratios, your ICRs and your LVRs and your whatever other Rs ratios can all be assisted with that sort of scheme. The second one is business planning, and that could perhaps be helping with that nice little information memorandum. It's going to take you a month, quite a lot of writing involved, and quite a daunting experience if you've not written one before. In my olden days, in the last century, in fact the last millennium, I used to receive about 3 information memoranda a day, and probably had to be woken up mid-afternoon when I was reading through them. So business planning can also be about which partnerships you would come together to make this deal work, how you would choose your developers and how you would monitor the results of the program as well. The third area is around property development, which we're taking more broadly to include both the organisation acting as a developer, but also potentially procuring through some turnkey project, some stuff that's already being built by a developer. And so we're looking here to provide skills that an organisation that's moving into the development space might not have. Now, we know the Tier 1s have often been doing development, but Tier 2s and Tier 3s might not do. So you would want some skills around property development, which can be provided by consultants. And it might be a mixed tenure scheme that's interesting. It might be some sustainable or accessible property design. It might be around getting deals across through the planning system. And it could be around the broader area of placemaking as well. And the fourth area, which of course is of great interest to bankers, is risk management. Banking is the business of risk, but it's actually the business of managing risks, as it is in your organisation as well. So what are the risks of this thing that you want the money for, and how can those risks be understood, managed, monitored, and mitigated? So these areas will be have been decided upon by NHFIC, and they will decide whether your need fits within one of these categories or another. But they're not designations where NHFIC couldn't decide that something needs a little bit of finance and one or two other things, and they will point you in that direction and say, find a consultant who can help with finance. So they're not exhaustive. And as you can tell, a number of them are quite related. So the finance, business planning, and risk management tend to be quite related to each other. Potentially property development a little bit more specialised. So those are the four things, the four areas in which you could get consultancy assistance. And here's the exciting point. Here are the dollars. We can't match the billions of dollars that NHFIC is providing, both for its bond finance and for its infrastructure fund, but we can say that the maximum that's available for a particular consultancy project will be $20,000. And the way that the contract has been written is that that's an amount inclusive of GST. Now, I know the consultants normally don't do figures inclusive of GST, but with a calculator, I'm sure we can bridge that one. We're not being unduly prescriptive as to how that is put together. So there are some tenders that have come out from government where there's a maximum amount that consultants can charge. You can include this and can't include that. We have to ensure that, in our opinion, which is the opinion largely of CHIA, but also in partnership with NHFIC, that this represents reasonable value for money. Now, we understand that not every community housing provider is based in a capital city. I'll wave to the people on the video who are not in a capital city. And so there may be some travel costs involved. And we also know that a senior partner in a major firm is not going to be charging the same rate as a junior who's just started as well. We understand the consulting business. But the proposal that's put together consulting funds needs to pass the eagle eyes of CHIA and of NHFIC as well. Now, the total funds available are $1.5 million. Now, that is a significant amount of money for capacity building in the sector. And I'm delighted that NHFIC have made this available. This is a really good time in the sector for this to be available, and that's a really good amount of money as well. And you can imagine that that's quite a few packages of $20,000 that are going to be available to help community housing providers and also help the consulting sector as well. So, Chapter 2, and this is where we get into a little bit more detail here. How do you get into this secret society of panel membership? There are no strange handshakes involved. We're not accepting any bribes. There is a formal process to go through. So any consultant can apply to be a panel member. You don't have to have attended this workshop, although you may be, you'll probably gain a little bit more insight if you do. And once you're on the panel, you can stay there until September 2020 or until anything goes wrong and there's some negative feedback, which of course we're hoping won't happen. Now, as consultants will realise, being on a panel doesn't actually mean necessarily anything's going to happen. There is no guarantee that there will be an equal assignment of the $1.5 million between the number of consultants who are on the panel. However, we're looking for a broad spread of consultants to be on the panel. We're looking for both individual sole traders, an individual person, a major business, KPMG's, Ernst & Young, the very large consulting firms they could probably fill this room many times over with all their staff, but also entrepreneurial consultants who choose to work together. Maybe you're 2 or 3 independent consultants. You want to work together because one person knows about risk, one person knows about property development as well. So providing there's an ABN, the form of consulting business is really up for discussion. But there are going to be 5 mandatory requirements, which is, if you like, is your driving test that you all will have to pass to get on the panel. So the first one is about track record, and I'm looking to see that individuals or the business has been providing consultancy for a couple of years and has good standing. This is really to avoid the fact that people might say, there's money coming along, I'm going to set up as a consultant because I know about the topic that's being talked about. From my experience, it's actually quite hard to understand the business of consulting until you've actually done it. So we want people to have evidenced that consulting track record. Second one is to have what I think are probably quite reasonable levels of professional indemnity or public liability insurance in place, or a willingness to get those in place if you're successful in getting on the panel and getting a project. The third one is really an understanding of the community housing sector and the types of organisations that operate. Now, much as I like giving presentations on the community housing sector, and I've given a few, I'm not looking for consultants to have to listen to one of those as well. I think they need to know the basics about the tax and the structure of the sector. And so that's probably going to be demonstrated by having worked either for or with a community housing organisation as well, rather than just coming straight into this field. The fourth mandatory requirement is that you should have expertise in at least one of those 4 service areas. If you've been advising on, board governance structures, that's not really going to cut it here. You're going to have experience in those 4 areas. And I know from the faces who are here, many people do have that. And the fifth one is value for money. And I suppose this in New South Wales terms would be the Daily Telegraph test. I get an idea of what the sort of structure is in the consulting sector. The junior people are going to be in a certain range of fees. The senior people are going to be in a certain range of fees. We're going to be seeing what the fees are across the structure. Do you fit within that broad range of what consultants generally are charging? Or are you putting forward a case where a person with not very much experience is trying to charge $500 an hour? We've got to rule out situations where there isn't good value for money. This is taxpayer money that we're spending on these grants. We've got to make sure that it's spent fairly. So the process. Now, having completed more application forms, both as a consultant and on behalf of community housing providers, than I would care to admit, some of which have actually been longer than my PhD thesis, and that wasn't short, we have now got agreement that this is going to be maybe the first ever 2-page application form with no attachments. And that's why we're keeping the tender for the panel membership only open for 3 weeks. Because I would imagine that the consultants we're seeing here today could probably fill it in 2 hours, and have a tea break as well in the middle. It's not going to be too difficult a process to complete. There is no point in me asking you what your fax number is or what your favourite colour is. It's only going to be the key information that we want to have in that form. So we're trying to make this process, like NHFIC is trying to make the lending process, we're trying to make the grant process as clear and as straightforward as possible. And depending on how many people apply, we may let all suitably qualified consultants go on the panel, or we may say, well, we've actually got 15 consultants all based in Melbourne who are all offering the same service. We may then cut that list down. Personally, I'd be quite in favour of every suitably qualified consultant that meets the minimum criteria going on the list, because I think it's a good source of information for everybody in the rest of the sector. But we're looking for, euphemistically called, a broad church here. We're looking for different skills to be satisfied, people able to offer expertise in different locations across the country. And we don't want it to be either totally dominated by individual one-person consultants or by the massive firms as well. We would like to see a good spread. We will be providing information on the CHIA website. The first page of the application form is the PR, selling, marketing, and good general information. And we think that should be available for everybody to see. And the second page is more the secret squirrel information, which we won't be putting on the website for everybody to see. But that means that not only people who are interested in this grant program, but others who may want to use your services can see what sort of consulting is being provided as well. And as you say, we're looking for everyone to remain on the panel if everyone behaves, which I'm sure everybody will do. And customers are satisfied, and it's all good a process. So in terms of the structure, there is a little bit of detail here, and I thought it might be easier for me to be able to talk this through. This will be in the expressions of interest document as well. But essentially, the two contracts that are entered into that you'll be interested in, there's going to be a contract between CHIA and the consultant once you're on the panel. So that's your sort of membership of the panel contract. And then when a particular consultancy project is agreed, there will then be a contract with the community housing organisation for that part of the deal as well. So it's a little bit of a sort of, it's like a three-legged stool. We've got CHIA, we've got the consultants, and we've got the community housing organisations. But if you like, the two contracts are with CHIA rather than necessarily directly being between the consultant and the community housing organisation. So that makes it a slightly different beast than we've been used to before. But it's going to be an open process, so I think everybody will see the way that the documentation goes. And that will be in a standard format, which we've worked through with NHFIC. Chapter 3 of the 4 chapters, the referral and grant process. And before we talk about any diagrams, this is not going to be a basis of community housing providers approaching consultants. This is the triangle again. The way that this happens is that the community housing organisation has got a fantastic idea to help disadvantaged people and build affordable housing, and they approach NHFIC. You approach NHFIC. And NHFIC kind of goes, kind of got a good idea, but needs a bit of help, or it needs quite a lot of help, so we can't approve it at the moment. And that's when NHFIC then press the button and trigger the grant funding. So they would then approach the Community Housing Industry Association, John Stott, myself, Tony Gilmore, and then we would then liaise with the community housing organisation to find a suitable consultant to work with. The choice of who the community housing organisation works with is their choice, if the consultant can provide those sort of services. But this isn't sort of quite married at first sight, but we are sort of a little bit of a marriage broker. So if a community housing organisation's a little bit too sure who to go out with on a date with a consultant, we can maybe suggest those that meet the criteria in terms of the services they provide, the geography they work in, or just their particular expertise. So we can help bring the thing together at that stage. But only on referrals that have come down from NHFIC. The Community Housing Industry Association doesn't make those decisions. The community housing organisation doesn't make those decisions. It comes down from NHFIC. Somebody would like some help with a bank loan request. This is complicated, so I won't go into it in too much detail, but there is basically an application form to fill in that's filled in by the community housing organisation with the help from the consultants. You can decide who does it. I might even allow 3 pages for this, but again, 2 pages might be enough as well. What is it that you want this consultant or consultancy firm to provide? How long is it going to be over? Who's getting paid what? What are the deliverables at the end of it? So in other words, it's what you would normally have as a consultant when you're working with a client. What is the nature of the transaction the consultant is helping with? And that application form kind of comes into CHIA, John and I. If it looks okay, goes to Natalie. If it looks okay, comes back to us, and then we start putting the wheels in motion to actually then document and make the transaction happen. So that's the flow of information going through. And so however many green blobs there are on the screen, just remember that a lot of things will actually come through John and I, who are helping deliver the CHIA assistance here. So you won't necessarily be dealing directly with NHFIC.
Tony, is that part of it set in stone? Because I think what we were expecting and hoping was that the grant was to assist us with pulling the initial application together. Most Tier 2 and 3 providers haven't had loans before, we haven't engaged in this sort of process before, and we were hoping that that grant was in fact to assist us along the way, rather than to identify weaknesses and then, to resource us to address those.
No, that's an important point and one we want to capture from this meeting, John, because clearly if a loan application comes in and it kind of gets turned down but needs a bit of work, that's pathway A. And that was how it was originally set up. But pathway B as well is, if you approach NHFIC with a sort of an expression of interest, it seems like a good idea. Seems like, it's not just a whim. This is actually, you've talked about a property, you've thought about a target group, but you need some assistance to actually put that together, to maybe put the information memorandum together. That can count. So you can approach, but you've got to approach NHFIC with that, rather than just sort of say, we'd like a grant. You go and say, this is the bones of what a transaction would look like. We've done some thinking about it. Could you provide some assistance? NHFIC can then approach us and say, there could be a grant available.
So can I just say, so that just to come back to what Ken said, it could be the approach to Ken, the initial approach to Ken, where the possibility of the grant comes out rather than having to fill out the long form.
Yeah, I'd say there's an initial discussion that happens first. If you've got a cracker of an idea, but you don't know how to make it work, and you see there's merits in it, and you will recognise that there's some knowledge gaps that need to be filled. I think that's probably when we start to look for, okay, is there a possibility that there might be some grant funding available to assist you through the process?
So we're going to specify this in more detail in the sort of rules that come out of the scheme in the information memorandum. But clearly the idea is to, this is not just something to address failure, if you like, applications that don't work. It's to encourage good applications as well. And I think this is based on the maturity that NHFIC have got in understanding that, if Tier 2s and Tier 3s haven't been in this game before, they're going to need some assistance going through. So yes, it's a good point, well made.
I'll be honest, I don't want to sift through bits of information. I'd rather receive a relatively polished piece of information that I can hang my hat on and say, okay, I support this. And I think through this would support that, as opposed to the CHP just trying to mow their way through and not really knowing. But if we can get a polished piece of material that we can use, that helps everyone.
Mm-hmm.
So it's interesting to get right upfront, as opposed to going through the rabbit hole and working out it's failed. I know, investing grant money and going back and try and redo it. Just get the right thing started.
So the idea of this is to assist CHPs with their applications. As has been said, we would expect that you have approached us through an EOI process, through the EOI, or through some other way. Whether you've called one of the origination team, but you've come to us. We've had those initial discussions with you. We may ask for some information so that we can assess whether you and the project would be eligible and whether what you're thinking would meet our relevant policies before we kind of send you down the path. Obviously, if it's way out of the ballpark, it's probably better off to tell you at that point. But as long as we've cleared some initial hurdles, then certainly we would see that you could access assistance to help you pull that application together in those four areas that Tony's talked about.
That's very encouraging.
We understand that not everybody has the capacity or the experience to put together a proper application. So as long as, even if it takes the form of a discussion, where we arrange to have a telephone conversation together or to meet and just say, look, overall the concept of this works and grant assistance would actually help you to put together an application. Happy to do that, but we just need to know that the concept that you're chasing is viable. So that's...
And the idea, you've raised a good point. I think it's also why this program has been targeted at Tier 2s and 3s. We sort of recognise that that's where there is some need for assistance in pulling applications together.
Good, or very positive. You know, we're not looking to maintain as much of the $1.5 million in the pot. We just need to make sure that the money is actually being used to support viable schemes that will help with social and affordable housing. Chapter 4, the final chapter. Now, this is just to mention really that the financial relationship, if you like, so raising invoices and getting them paid, goes through CHIA. So the relationship isn't directly between, let's say, the consultants and NHFIC in terms of the dollars going through. It's going to be through CHIA. And that will add, you know, an extra step in the process, but we're going to be very efficient, John and I, in processing, because as consultants ourselves, most of the time, we know how nice it is to get paid in reasonable time periods. So basically, when the project has been completed, you know, we check that both the community housing organisation and the consultants are happy with what's been done and that the project has actually delivered what it said it did. So if the project says, we're going to deliver you an information memorandum, you know, in a month's time, make sure that that's actually gone through there. We're not actually going through and reading everything in detail, fascinating as it would be, I'm sure. We then do the invoicing process. So essentially, the consultant invoices CHIA, CHIA invoices NHFIC, NHFIC pay CHIA, and CHIA pay the consultant. You know, it'll in the alchemy of finances, it should go through in 2 to 3 weeks, and also in the contract we've got with NHFIC as well, they've said they're going to turn things around in a particular period of time, and we're going to do the same as well. So we're not looking to keep consultants on the edge of their seat waiting for payments to come through, but just to see who the relationship is with, I think, is important. Now, one of the things that's really important, of course, through this process is to avoid conflicts of interest. Now, the conflicts could occur, you know, with the consultants, with the community housing organisation, with CHIA, or with John and I as contractors for CHIA as well. So these rules are going to apply to everyone. And the idea is that, you know, anything that could be seen to limit the ability of people to act diligently and independently. So, in other words, you know, if John and I were being seen to favour our friendly consultants at the expense of anybody else, if a consultant was applying for something that, you know, they'd already done before and didn't need to do again, if there's anything that's unusual, it has to be brought to the attention of initially CHIA and will then be decided on by NHFIC. So, you know, conflicts of interest policies are always put into all the consulting work that we do, but I think it's particularly important here that we're seen to be open and honest as well as to who's doing what and who's getting what. It's got to be completely above board, because at the end of the day, this is quite a lot of public money that's being invested in the scheme. So that's the mechanics of it, and in I think the rather snappy expression of interest document, which will be hopefully with you quite soon, it will again spell out those issues in detail as to who's doing what within the process. But I think now, if we can have any questions, I'd probably like to focus this first really on issues that might be of particular interest